Hi, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on doing sociology with Professor James Staples. Today, we are going to talk about meat eating, environmental concerns, and social identities, a very, very relevant and contemporary topic in the present context. Very quickly introducing our speaker, he is a professor of social anthropology at Brunel University of London and also a co-host of the Migration Menu podcast. James Staples' research, which he carried out in southern part of India and most recently in West London, includes a focus on the anthropology of food. And his most recent book is Sacred Cows and Chicken Manchurian: The Everyday Politics of Eating Meat in India. Professor Staples, I'm very happy to welcome you to this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So let me begin by asking this question about your ethnographic experiences in the Indian context. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Okay, yeah, sure. I mean, the first time I went to India was, in fact, just over 40 years ago in 1984, which initially wasn't as an anthropologist. It was as a school leaver. I was a volunteer in a leprosy colony, which I ended up doing field work in many years later. And I guess it was during that trip, really the first time I'd left the UK for a prolonged period, that I had that kind of realization that there were very different ways of doing social life, if you like. There are various different ways in which one could live, not a single right or wrong way. And it challenged a lot the kinds of assumptions I had, having grown up in a small town in the southeast of England. So I returned several times. I eventually, as a consequence, I think, of those trips, ended up doing a degree in anthropology at SOAS in the late 1980s. And eventually I also went back to do a PhD, which was in the late 1990s. So I guess my first ethnographic fieldwork proper, as it were, my first full-blown fieldwork, the first time I spent over a year in India was 1999 to 2000, which was a significant time in relation to the work I was doing on leprosy, because the year 2000 was earmarked as this year when leprosy was meant to be eliminated as a global health problem. And I was doing field work in this small rural community of leprosy affected people, a self-run colony, village of about 1,000 people, really trying to find out more about their social life, the kinds of things that were of interest to them that made them tick and so on. Looking really, I guess, at the social aspects rather than the medical aspects of leprosy. I then returned, I guess, must have been as a postdoc in around 2005, and I shifted then to doing field work in Hyderabad, the city of Hyderabad in South India, where I shifted my focus slightly, or tried to broaden my focus, in order to do work on disability more generally, but also to think about how I might do field work in an urban setting. Whereas, in the village, in this small community where I'd worked previously, in some ways it was quite easy to do field work. You sat outside your house. All of social life, particularly in those days, tended to go on outside of people's houses, in the streets. I knew most of the people in this village. Participant observation was relatively straightforward, whereas doing a similar kind of thing in the city was much more challenging. That social life was much more fragmented. The disabled, as it were, disabled people obviously didn't live together as one community in the way that people had in a leprosy colony. So, I had to have various different locations for doing field work, outpatients clinics of hospitals, daycare centres. There was a school for the blind. I worked with people who had physical disabilities who were begging on the streets, so I'd hang out with them some of the time. So a very different kind of experience of field work. And while I was doing that, I would still commute every now and then back to the leprosy colony, really as a kind of retreat place that I had in the countryside in coastal Andhra. And one of the things that happened during that period was that there was a kind of spike in the number of suicides or attempted suicides or acts of self-harm that were being carried out by young people in the village. So generally young, healthy people, people who didn't have leprosy, whose parents or grandparents had leprosy, who in many cases were much more educated than their parents. So on the face of it, seemed to have less reason to want to commit those acts. So it was a fairly disturbing thing, but also something which intrigued me and which I later went on to do some more research on. So I guess in a way that was indicative, I guess, of my approach to field work, which is very much to try to follow what's going on the ground when you get there, rather than sticking, doggedly to a preconceived idea of what you want to do research about. I think it's kind of important to go with what the people that you're working with appear to have particular interests in, and that was how I got onto that. And I guess in a way that's how I came back to food as well. I mean, I sometimes say it's as a way of cheering myself up after doing topics that were not necessarily seen as particularly cheerful topics to focus on, although food isn't necessarily either, actually, as it turned out. Really because I was invited to give a paper, or not to give a paper, actually, just to take part in a workshop that was taking place at SOAS. It was being organized by the anthropologist Carolina Seller. It was in the early 2000s, I guess, which was about food and about meat, about this vegetarian, non-vegetarian divide that you see across India, that I was kind of aware of, but hadn't really given much thought to. And I thought, well, I don't really have very much material on this, until I started looking through the index of my field notes and discovered that I actually had more notes on food, both on meat and other kinds of food, as well as foodways, on festivals, on feasts, on who ate with who didn't eat from other people, and so on. More notes on food and foodways than probably any other topic that I had. So I've unwittingly, in a way, been doing field work on food all the time, but it was only really then that I turned my attention to it much more specifically. And I guess that was probably the most recent field work that I did in India, anyway, was in preparation for that book, Sacred Cows and Chicken Manchurian, the book that you kindly plugged for me in your introduction. That was my most recent book, and which dealt, I think, with the everyday politics, as I think the subtitle describes it, the everyday politics of eating meat or not eating meat in India, particularly in South India, which I think there hadn't been so much written on at the time. So that's a kind of a quick portrait of my main ethnographic encounters. I mean, the more recent ones have been on the streets of West London, really working with South Asian diasporas, particularly from India, but also other parts of South Asia, who run restaurants. So again, it's about food, but it's also about the migration stories of food and of people from South Asia to West London, and how they've really remade that area anew.
Right, right. So let me ask you this very broad question about, what is the significance of meat in human social life?
Gosh, yeah, I mean, that is a really big question, isn't it? And I think there's probably no simple answer. I think it's something that anthropologists in particular, and sociologists as well, have been interested in for a very long time. I mean, you had structuralist anthropologists, for example, Levi-Strauss famously looking at these ideas of the cooked and the uncooked, particularly in relation to meat and the culinary triangle, as he described it. This would have been, I think, early to mid 1960s. You had people like Marshall Salins in the United States, also writing about food from a structuralist perspective. Mary Douglas in the UK, very interested in those symbolic aspects of food, how foods related to one another. I mean, I suppose what they were all looking at in a way were the symbolic values of food, the symbolic values that food plays in social life, and in particular in relation to meat. And also how meat fits into a kind of wider collection of symbols, a wider system of symbols, rather than in itself necessarily having meaning. That for structuralists, it was often the relationships between things that mattered to one another. So you have, Marshall Salins, for example, who argued, I think, that one of the reasons why people in North America, which is where he lived, why they didn't eat cats and dogs, for example, was not because cats and dogs don't taste very nice or because they're not nutritious. He suggests that, they could be reared safely, could be reared in a way that would make them good to eat. But that we don't eat them, whereas or North Americans do eat other kinds of animals fairly unproblematically. And he was kind of intrigued with the question of why that was the case. And the answer he came up with was really that we classified dogs and cats and other companion animals in the same way that we categorize kin. So in a way, to eat our dog or to eat our cat would be, like eating our mother or like eating our sister, for example. We don't eat those things which are close to us. And then he, plots out and lists out various kinds of animals in relation to the distance that they stand from human beings. So something like a horse, for example, which also might be given a name, as we would give a name to a dog or a pet cat. But we don't generally have living in our houses with us. They live a bit further away in a stable. So, we name them, they're a bit close to us, so still quite taboo. Most people in North America don't eat the meat of the horse. In France, of course, famously, horse is eaten a lot, not eaten in the UK. So it's a bit taboo, but not quite as taboo as to eat a dog or a cat. And then further away still are these animals which live their lives entirely apart. So things like cows or sheep or goats or chickens, for example. These things which certainly in the American context and the Western European context live their lives separately from humans, largely, unless you're a farmer. They live on farms. You might spot them in the distance in a field, but you don't have that day-to-day kin-like kind of relationship with them, and therefore they're treated like objects and are seen as good to eat. And then you also have Mary Douglas looking at the specific kind of animals that are seen as being good to eat and not good to eat. I mean, she argues that the things that we don't eat are often those things which don't fit the ready-made kind of categories that we have. So again, a very structuralist kind of argument, that we don't eat the pangolin, for example, which she talks about in relation to the Lele people, is it, in where she did her field work in part of Africa, as not being eaten because they're a land animal but look a bit like a fish. So they're neither one thing nor the other. So there were other kinds of reasons that one could come up with within these structuralist patterns within these systems that made some things good to eat and some things not. But that these reasons were social and that these reasons were cultural rather than based only on the nutritional qualities or the taste even of the thing that we might be eating. So I think that's quite interesting. I mean, I think those kinds of grand theories tend to, I suppose, delete some of the nuances, some of the variations that we get, and also which don't really allow very much for the kind of change that we see all the time. So as societies change, so the things which we might consider good to eat or not good to eat are also in a kind of constant flux. Then, of course, you also have these cultural variations in what people consider good to eat and not good to eat, which might relate to religion, for example. So Jewish people or Muslims not eating pork for various reasons. And there have been various different arguments put forward for the origins of that. And in the Indian context, bringing it back to India, in particular, that consumption of beef or the meat of the cow in particular is perhaps the biggest taboo, not because the meat of the cow itself is seen as impure, but in fact because the cow is seen as a sacred animal, and which in some ways fits with that Salin's kind of notion of us not eating things that are kin, because the cow is visualized very often in Hinduism as the mother of the nation, as our mother. It's like a mother provides milk, that we would drink from our own mothers as babies. So you've got all of these different kinds of things going on. I think um, significant too in terms of gender relations, for example. I mean, the eating of meat is often associated in popular discourse with masculinity, that you become more male through eating red meat and so on. I mean, that was, I guess, famously challenged by Gandhi, who kind of tried to, Mahatma Gandhi, who tried to upturn those ideas of this, brutish Western kind of masculinity of the colonizer, and to resist that through vegetarianism, through veneration of the cow. So yeah, no single simple answer to this, what the significance is of meat in human social life, other than to say, I think it is pretty significant, both as a symbol, but also as a material thing.
So, talking about the Indian context, how is meat eating shaped in India, particularly among South Indian Christians, because you have done your ethnographic work in that region?
Yeah, I mean, as I've said, in general, I think there are taboos about food in line with taboos about food more generally. Who one can accept food from or not accept food from. Um, I mean, among the mainstream, I suppose, of Hinduism, which is, of course, the majority religion in India, who you can accept food from has traditionally been something which has been quite important, because the qualities of the cook are seen often to go um, into the food that one prepares, whether that's rice or rice in particular, but also other things as well. Um, and I think one of the big differences, perhaps, in how things have been shaped in India and in South Asia compared to certain other parts of the world, is that for Hindus, for high caste Hindus in particular, and particularly for Brahmins and Vaishyas, um, status or moral status is marked more by vegetarianism than by eating meat. So vegetarianism is the highest status, and it goes down, and you have Shudras who permitted to eat meat, but not in any circumstances the meat of the cow, who don't eat beef. Um, so I think that context is important in trying to understand the context of meat eating among South Indian Christians, or among Christians in India more generally, as well as actually other minority groups like Muslims, for example. In that, for many of the Christians that I worked with, particularly when Hindu nationalism was rising, sort of been in the early kind of 2000s, and there was a real move against eating beef or eating meat more generally, but particularly about eating beef and the meat of the cow. During that period, I think eating beef for those Christians, or many of the Christians that I spoke to, became a real positive marker, I think, of their own identity. So it wasn't something to be ashamed of. It wasn't something seen as impure, in the way that eating buffalo meat might have been acceptable for Dalits, for example, for those seen as outside the Hindu caste system, but still somehow within that cosmology. Whereas for them, it was acceptable to eat the meat of buffalo, but that meat in itself, eating that meat, was seen as demeaning, and which shored up their low social status more generally. Whereas I think for the Christians that I worked with, eating beef was seen, very much as a kind of celebration, a positive celebration of a particular identity. This is something that tastes good. We can eat it. These other people can't. More for them. This is something we want to celebrate, and which is an integral part of who we are. And I think at other times, so when Congress came back into power, for example, it became less significant. This was something I noticed, in talking to people about their eating habits. It had less symbolic value at that point of time. So people might still have liked it or enjoyed it or wanted to buy it, but it was affected by these other kinds of things that were going on in the background at the same time. I mean, it was through that, and I think I write about this in the book, through going to lunch with a Christian, my Telugu teacher, who was a Christian. I think her family had converted back in the 1930s in these mass conversion movements. So all of her life she had been a Christian. She'd been born into a Christian family. Um, and I told her before I went to this meal that I was vegetarian, that I didn't eat meat myself. And I didn't think this would be an issue because, going to India was one place in the world that was actually very easy to be a vegetarian, unlike in some, in some parts of the West. But still at that meal, she had prepared a beef curry and, trying to get me to try some. I think one of my articles, I've got the title of the article is something like, go on, just try some. And I kind of twigged what she was doing and said, no, I don't eat this. And she was slightly offended by that. And it was trying to make sense of why she was offended in a context where there were so many vegetarians, where so many people didn't, or so I thought there were so many vegetarians, not as many perhaps as I initially thought. It was in trying to make sense of that that I came to this realization of why eating beef was symbolically important, particularly at that point in history for Christians in South India, and I think probably in other parts of India as well.
So, apart from how the South Indians eat meat, do you see that factors and social identities like caste and religion also play a role in how meat is ate in a country like India?
Yeah, definitely. Did you say caste or class? Did you say that?
Caste, religion.
This was caste. Yeah, I mean, definitely. Yeah, traditionally Brahmins, of course, don't eat any meat at all. Kshatriyas or people in the various subcastes of Kshatriyas can eat meat, not usually beef. Vaishyas, this trading caste or set of castes who don't eat meat, who are vegetarian, and then Shudras at the bottom of the four Varna system of caste, who traditionally do eat meat but don't eat beef. Also, I think within that, and certainly speaking to Shudra people from Shudra castes in Andhra Pradesh, and there were a number of different castes there, and often they were actually the most powerful castes in the states, in the Naidus, Reddys, and so on. Who would talk about it not only in terms of which meats you could eat. You could eat goat meat and you could eat goat mutton, or you could eat chicken, for example, or you eat fish, but also the kinds of preparations of meat, which also signified some kind of social status. The fried preparations, people would say, were often, associated with people from lower castes or rough drinking kind of fellows. So something like chicken fry or fish fry was often seen as an accompaniment to alcohol, and therefore serving that dish, although lots of people liked the taste of it, was seen as something more low status than chicken curry in a sauce, in a gravy, in a rasam. So you had those kind of variations, as well in relation to caste, and then those who were notionally outside of that caste system, so Dalits, who could eat some of those other things, such as beef, for example, particularly buffalo beef. But within that caste system, eating beef, eating the meat of buffalo, there was still, in some senses, often seen as degrading. It hadn't been reclaimed in quite the same way as it had by the Christians that I've worked with. If that answers, I'm not sure if that answers your question fully or not, but feel free to come back to it.
No, I also wanted to ask about the role that class plays, because this is something that you also talk about. So apart from
Yeah.
caste, you could also talk about class.
Class, yeah, certainly. Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question, I think, because although caste and class are not the same as one another, in some ways they're quite different. There's a lot of overlap, I think, between them. And, there's often that phrase that people, use when they describe themselves as being upper class and upper caste. The two, often go together. A lot of upper class people are also upper caste. But I think they're also quite different and sometimes contradictory values attributed to each. That the meat taboos in caste terms, for example, as I've talked about, often make that, I suppose, equation between eating meat and low status, unlike perhaps in the West. But in class terms, and again, obviously there are variations on this, and you've got sort of traditional ideas about class, and what it meant traditionally to be middle class in the Indian context. But also this new emergent middle class, which ties in much more, I think, to these globalized kind of values, particularly in this sort of post-liberalization era, where conspicuous consumption is much more possible, where there are far more restaurants where you can be seen eating out, and where food can be used as a marker of status. I think in those contexts, meat and certain preparations of meat, particularly foreign preparations, for example, can be equated to high status. So in a way, you've got the opposite thing going on. That if you're urban, relatively young, metropolitan, educated, if you're the kind of person who feels equally at home in Delhi, for example, as you might do in New York or London, I think that you're much more likely to eat meat in a restaurant, and for that consumption to be able to go there and eat it and know how to eat it, know what to eat it with, and so on. Those things can enhance one's class status or demonstrate one's class status. Whereas eating meat, perhaps in the home, would be a much more negative kind of indicator of status. And I think often that you have the two things going on at the same time. So you might, draw on the fact that your mother remains vegetarian, for example, and that no meat is cooked in your household, when you go home, but being able to go out and share food and share meat in particular, with other people in restaurants and those sorts of places of public consumption can also enhance your status at the same time. So there's a kind of interesting tension that is going on there, I think.
Right. I think, yeah, I mean, I can sort of think about similarities in other parts of India as well.
Mm.
There's a different question about also the industrializing and transnational modes of meat provisioning, that, what impact they have on social practices and cultural understandings that surround the use of animal as foods. I think, this
Mm.
article you wrote was before the pandemic, but then, a lot of things changed with what happened
Mm.
with the 19 pandemic. So if you could also answer this question.
Yeah, again, really interesting question. I mean, thinking in particular about chicken, I think, because there's been a lot written about this idea of the global chicken, the changing chicken, um, and particularly among, my interlocutors who, in the past, when I was there in the 1980s in particular, and I think through into the 1990s as well, many people in the village would keep what they call country birds, these country chickens, which they'd rear. They would often sell to their neighbors. I mean, interestingly, people didn't eat their own chickens by and large. They kind of swapped them over. So there was a kind of, again, this thing about not eating your kin. Um, but people would often rear a lot of the meat that was consumed within the village, in the village itself. There were people who kept goats. A lot more people back then, kept their own buffalo. And I think that's changed. I mean, it's changed for a number of reasons, but one of the things that's really changed and has been, I guess, has been going on since the 1960s, has been the growth of these very big chicken farms, which produce broiler chickens. And they're these white feathered birds that look quite different to these sort of orangey, reddish brown country birds that people reared at home. And which I think crucially could be reared within 6 weeks. So, within 6 weeks of the egg hatching, within 6 weeks they could be in a pot on somebody's table. You could have a chicken curry made out of them, whereas those that you reared at home would take 6 months to reach the kind of size that you would need for that. So I think it's had a big difference, or firstly in the availability of things like chicken. So people who told me about, in the 60s and 70s, you might like to eat more, but you probably ate meat, if you were lucky, 3 or 4 times a year, perhaps. This was at village level. Now that chicken was produced in this way and it was much cheaper, meant that it was much more available. You could have chicken every Sunday. So in a way, you could show that status by having meat every Sunday, and you could enjoy it having it every Sunday, even though people said it didn't taste as good as the old country birds. It was too tender, didn't have as much flavor, and so on and so on. There was a whole discourse about that. But also the fact that you could have it every Sunday also meant that its status had, in some ways, diminished. It's almost like having vegetables. And I think it was Godrej at one time had an advertising campaign for its frozen chicken that, argued that our chicken is actually cheaper than vegetables, so everybody can buy it, which in some senses for people was seen as a good thing because it made it more available, but at the same time, also meant that it decreased its status. I think also this change, this material change in the animal, and I guess this could also be applied to other animals as well, means that the ways in which it's eaten or the ways in which it's cooked might vary. Once you could buy frozen chicken, for example, and I've written, I think, in the book about people talking in Calcutta about how you could go to a supermarket and buy 6 chicken breasts or 6 chicken thighs, whereas previously when you went to the market, you went, the birds would be alive behind you. One would be taken out, its head would be chopped off, the feathers would be taken off, and so on. It will be chopped up for you. It was definitely an animal that had been alive. You couldn't distance it from yourself in that way. And still, lots of the birds that were eaten in the village where I worked were still consumed in that way. But if you bought it from a supermarket, not only was it much more distanced from the animal itself, as I think it is largely in the UK. I mean, I think people don't really think about chickens when they buy chicken. They're just these sort of lumps of white stuff that you buy and you cook in the oven or fry or whatever. And the fact that you could buy thighs or just chicken breasts, for example, meant that you could make other kinds of recipes that wouldn't have been possible just with this chopped up single chicken that lent itself very well to particular kinds of curry preparations that were the most usual preparations in South India where I worked. You could now make Mediterranean dishes in tomato sauces and this sort of thing. So you had this other avenue here in this post-liberalization period by which you could also show status by making these different things. And you had access also to recipes and instructions on how to make these things because of the increasing use of smartphones, access to YouTube and so on, so that I would go to people's houses, even in the village to dinner, who would have looked up recipes on YouTube and were making things that their mothers and grandmothers hadn't made, whereas previously you relied almost entirely on recipes being handed down to you, and you might have tweaked them a bit, but you didn't have this much more global kind of access to other cuisines, which again were a way of being able to show your learning, possibly sophistication and so on, and also to experiment with things that you might like to eat. Think about ways in which you might use food to change your identity or to reflect different aspects of yourself. So I think, clearly that's changed social practices. It's changed cultural understandings of meat as well. I mean, I think, I could go on and on talking about this for ages, but I think I'll probably stop there because that's probably given you enough food for thought, if you'll pardon the pun.
Right. Last question. How do you think new environmental fears, health concerns, and alternative food movements are reshaping the boundaries between humans and then the animals that we eat?
Okay, I mean, because environment I was thinking about that in relation also to the last question, actually, these industrializing and transnational modes of meat production as well, which obviously have in themselves an impact on the environment. And I think it varies also depending on the kinds of groups that you're speaking to, whether you're speaking to the people that I knew who lived in villages, for example, or other people who are activists, for example. I mean, at village level, there were certainly health concerns, and these had emerged, I think, in more recent times. I mean, I think the fact that nearly all, or perhaps it was all new diseases in the last, I don't know, 50 or so years, um, have been caused by diseases jumping from animals to humans, which I think certainly hasn't been lost on people that I've worked with. Things like, was it mad cow disease? But you also had, I mean, AIDS, HIV was seen as being, coming from animals to humans, and COVID as well, of course, more recently. And on one of my trips to the village, there was a disease called chikungunya, which actually has nothing to do with chickens, but the name of it sounds a bit like chickens. So it was often associated with a disease that was somehow being spread to them through chickens, through these large chicken farms, which were on the border of the village where I worked. So there were fears in relation to these, I suppose, industrialized forms of production, that diseases could spread to humans from there, that you had this sort of dust that came over, this, I suppose, fecal matter from chickens, that didn't smell very nice. It smelled pretty horrible, and which people thought they could potentially get diseases from. At local level, there were also fears about pesticides, about chemicals that were used on crops, but which were also fed to animals to feed them. And again, you had, on the one hand, a lot of nostalgia about how things used to taste in the past. People talked about, how good it was to eat carrots when carrots really tasted of carrots, or they tasted of the mutti, they tasted of the earth from which the vegetables came. But at the same time as that, having a fear of these chemicals, which they didn't really know quite what they did, being used to increase crop yields and so on. So people would use them, clearly, if they had a small amount of land, because it obviously made a difference, did increase their yield. There was some concerns over that. And I think I spoke earlier about fewer people now having animals at home, having their own chickens, goats, buffaloes, and so on. In part, that was to do, as I said, with the industrialized chicken, making chicken, if you bought it outside, much cheaper than rearing one yourself. But there was also a fear both of chickens eating other people's crops and those crops poisoning the chickens. So there was a risk to the health of, you couldn't guarantee that your chicken would survive, to make it to the table. But also with urbanization, you had increasingly fewer places where you could take your animals out to graze than you did in the past, that the area where I worked was becoming much more built up. So you had a number of things all going on at the same time, which meant that people were much more likely to buy things like milk from outside dairies, that had been pasteurized and put into these plastic packets that you bought, rather than having their own milk from buffaloes, as they would have done in the past, or from neighbors' buffaloes, buying eggs from the shops, and so on. So there was that distancing, I think, also between people and the food that they ate, which allowed, you had a space in between, which allowed some of those fears, often quite justified fears, I think, in relation to health and environmental change, and so on. So you had all that going on at village level. I think you also saw, certainly I saw when I was in Hyderabad and Chennai and other major cities, and in Delhi, you do see an increase, in the number of organic food shops, for example, which, I don't think any of the people that I worked with shopped in those. I don't think they could afford to shop in them or really paid much attention to them. But again, this was another seen as a middle class phenomena, that you had that interest, really, I suppose, motivated by interest in one's own health, perhaps rather than interest in the planetary health more generally, but perhaps also a recognition that, if the planet wasn't healthy, if global warming continues, the way it does, that isn't going to be a good thing for anybody. You also have, increased numbers of vegans, for example, which again offers a different kind of imaginary to the standard kind of vegetarian Indian imaginary, the Hindu vegetarian imaginary, which is not eating meat or eggs, but which really valorizes dairy products, so things like butter, ghee, cream, yogurt, curd, and so on. That these things are often very valorized by the very high caste vegetarians who might look down on meat eating, but who vegans and others have argued that meat is actually a byproduct of that dairy industry. So there's something very political going on there as well. Otherwise, such is the demand for dairy products in India that you need to breed lots of cows, lots of buffaloes, and then you have lots of excess animals when they can no longer produce milk, or can no longer produce dairy products. So in a way, beef consumption, particularly among Dalits, among Christians, offers an endpoint for those products. It's a byproduct really of the dairy industry. So there's that to take in as well. So I think certainly among the people that I worked with, they were not overly concerned about their own beef consumption or their own meat consumption, because they still ate meat, perhaps once a week. So were relatively small consumers of meat compared to people in other parts of the world, particularly North America. Although, with India having a population of 1.2 billion, I think it is, very big population. So even small increases in the amount of meat that's consumed there can have quite a big impact globally on the environment. So yeah, obviously that's something to continue to think about. But I think for them at village level, that wasn't a major concern that had, apart from in the areas that I've mentioned, hadn't yet become a really significant concern. But certainly there were, concerns about health, and the issues, particularly of eating food that had been changed by chemicals, or meat that had been reared in particular ways as opposed to the old ways. So partly about nostalgia, but also partly, I think, a very rational response to some of the changes that have been going on in the world and the kind of environmental changes that you end up seeing in everyday life. I think it feels noticeably hotter, going to Delhi, for example, if you land in May than it did, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. Changing rain patterns and all of those sorts of things that are happening are things which people notice, and I think which people who live closer to the land, who live and farm their own small plots, keep animals and so on, in some ways much more attuned to those things than those of us who live in cities.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. I think this has been a very engaging conversation, and I hope our viewers take away the meanings of meat eating and the cultural politics and that of the political economy from the conversation. So I'd like to thank you once again for giving us this time and effort. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.